Very good evening. It's great to see you all here. As I was coming in, I was told that I was the highbrow part of the Science Festival, which I'm not sure if that terrifies you or me more, but that wasn't what I was intending for tonight. I was hoping we were going to have a bit of fun, and we were going to have a few things to think about. So maybe at the end you can tell me whether I've succeeded in that. So, back in 1990, 34 years ago, two things happened to me. The first thing was I went to university in order to start a career in physics. The other thing that happened to me was I became a Christian. I guess the physics bit wasn't a surprise. I've been planning that since I've been about age 3, I think. The becoming a Christian was a very big surprise. I certainly hadn't been planning that. Nevertheless, it meant that pretty much from day one of my formal physics training, I was already living this question of are science and faith friends or foes? So 34 years later, I'm still trying to work that out. I'm going to just try and share a few of the things that I've learned along the way. I'm coming at this as a Christian, and I'll be speaking tonight primarily from a Christian perspective, but actually a lot of the things that I say are equally true of many other religions as well, certainly the monotheistic religions. And if anybody wants to talk more about that, that's something we can pick up in the questions. So I guess for me, this question was brought into focus by a friend of mine who's a vicar. And he'd organised an event at his church, and he was chatting to people on the door on a Sunday morning on their way out. And he said to one lady who'd come to the service, will you be coming to the event? And she said, yeah, definitely. And he said, what about your husband? Would he like to come as well? And she said, no, he's a scientist. As if that somehow explained why he wouldn't want to come to a church event. It was just implicit in her answer that if you're a scientist, you'll have nothing to do with religion. And that puzzles me, because all of my adult life, all of my professional life in science, I've always found a full and diverse range of people around me. I've found people of no faith, and I've found people of very profound faith. And I'd never really noticed that much difference inside the lab compared to what you meet in the pub or in normal life. And so where does this idea come from? That if you're a scientist, you can't have anything to do with faith. And I think there are a number of reasons. I'm going to pick on just a few of what I think are the mistakes, the misunderstandings that happen between people of faith and scientists that leads to this false conclusion that somehow you can't do both. So here are what I think are the mistakes, the misunderstandings. The first is what's sometimes called the God of the gaps fallacy. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll then talk a little bit about the idea that science and faith are rival explanations, and that you have to choose one, therefore reject the other. We'll talk a little bit about the Bible and what its truth claims really are. And then we'll talk a little bit about Charles Darwin, because I think for many people, they think that Darwin is somehow at the root of this conflict. And then, assuming we've still got a few minutes left, I'll give you a final thought, just to chew over before we have a break. So, let's get going. So, God of the gaps fallacy. So the God of the gaps fallacy, just by fallacy as in something that isn't true, but people often think is true. So I don't believe that God of the gaps is a real thing, but let me explain how people see it. The God of the gaps fallacy imagines that scientific knowledge is like a nice piece of Swiss cheese, that it's largely a solid, but it's got some big holes in it in different places. I gave this talk in India just before Christmas, and they had no idea what Swiss cheese was. And I had to explain that in the West we pay extra for cheese with holes in. They think we're crazy. But anyway, and the idea of the Swiss cheese is that the solid of the cheese is all of scientific knowledge as we currently have it. But obviously we don't know everything, otherwise I wouldn't have a job. There are still some holes to fill in, and that from a faith perspective, those holes are where God resides. So God is the bits that we don't understand, and the bits that we do understand are science. And of course, if you believe that, that is problematic, and it means that scientists who are largely engaged in the process of filling the holes are your enemy, because they are there to eliminate the bits that are God. And you can absolutely understand if you see that as how God and faith fit together, as how science and faith fit together, then you will see automatically that there's a conflict. But I think this is a mistaken view of both theology and of scientific knowledge. And as is so often the case, the old theologian Augustine, going right back to 354 AD, he really nailed it when he says, nature is what God does. In other words, what we call nature, or scientific knowledge, is everything that God is doing. So God isn't just the gaps, God is the solid, God is the cheese. And therefore it doesn't matter whether something in nature is understood by science or is not understood by science. It doesn't change whether it's God's activity. And so, from my perspective, the process of filling in the holes in the cheese is actually about seeing more clearly and understanding in more detail everything that God has done. So I think of the antidote to the God of the gaps fallacy, and it's just up the road there in Cambridge. So my laboratory, the Cavendish Laboratory, which is the Department of Physics for Cambridge University, we are currently out in a horrible old building on the west side, but we used to be in a lovely stone building in the centre of town called the Old Cavendish Laboratory. And if you go there, it looks like so many Cambridge buildings, lots of old stone with beautiful carvings. And if you look closely, you can actually see when the doors are closed, which is a bit of a design flaw, but anyway, if you look closely, you'll see there's some Latin engraved in the doors there. And if you decipher that, what it actually says is, "Great are the works of the Lord, they are pondered by all who delight in them," which some of you may recognise as a quote from the Bible, from Psalm 111. Now that's a strange thing to have above the door of the Cavendish Physics Laboratory. And the reason that it's there is the first Cavendish professor, who was James Clerk Maxwell, who is in many senses the father of electromagnetism. He was not only a brilliant physicist, but he was also a very committed Christian. And when he arrived at his laboratory, completely new, it was up to him to really set the direction. He said, you know, the things that we do in this lab are examining the works of the Lord. That's really what we're all about here. And just so that we don't forget it, let's write it above the door. In the 1970s, when that building came to the end of its useful life and we moved out to the west side, it was so clearly understood that this view of Maxwell as science in general, and physics in particular, as being the process of examining what God has made, so clearly Maxwell's motivation that it was recreated in modern English above the door. So to this day, if you go into university's physics lab, you see above it, "The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein." Now that's not to say that everybody who works in that building believes that, but what it means is that at its heart, Cambridge physics was founded on the premise that it was the investigation of the works of God. And we see a similar thing. Let me introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Wiseman. So Jennifer works for NASA. She's a senior project scientist on the Hubble telescope. And she said, since God is responsible for all nature, there is nothing to fear in studying the details. In fact, God calls us to study his handiwork as a means to learning of God's character and glory. So here we have this really tightly integrated view of science and faith, where science is the process of studying the details of what God has made. And although Jennifer is a modern woman, this is actually a very old thought. So if we go all the way back to Johannes Kepler, those of you who did any science at school may remember Kepler and his laws of planetary motion, planets going around the sun in elliptical orbits. This was Kepler who came up with all of that. And he said, I had the intention of becoming a theologian. Remember, Kepler was one of the early scientists. I had the intention of becoming a theologian, but now I see how God is by my endeavours also glorified in astronomy, for the heavens declare the glory of God. So whether it's modern day science with people like Jennifer Wiseman from NASA, or the roots of science, people like Johannes Kepler, or points in between people like James Clerk Maxwell, there's this overriding view that doesn't see God as just being the little bits of science we don't know, but actually God being responsible for all of nature, and therefore science is the study of his activity. So that's all I want to say on the God of the Gaps fallacy. Let's think now a little bit about the idea of rival explanations. So sometimes it feels a little bit like this, that on the one hand we're being offered the Bible, and on the other hand we're being offered the microscope and telescope, and being told you have to choose. And certainly if we talk to somebody like Professor Richard Dawkins, he would say this is absolutely the case. You must choose. You can't straddle. There's somebody who parks their car in the university car park near to me. On his bumper, he's got this little badge, which is a little Christian ichthus fish, but with the words Darwin written in and converted into a little dinosaur with some little legs there. And I looked up on the website out of curiosity as to what was being said about this little badge, and the company that sells them describes it as the classic design for those who favour the Galapagos over the Garden of Eden. And again, it's this idea you have to choose. You can either have the Garden of Eden in the Bible, or you can have the Galapagos Islands and Charles Darwin's theory. But actually, is that the case? Do we really have to choose? And what is it that scientists actually do? The way I see it, and this goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas and these ancient medieval theologians, is that God is what's sometimes referred to as the primary cause. God is the root of everything. And that everything that exists has been made by God, and that includes all of the secondary causes whereby those things exist, which is what we today call the laws of science. So I see the laws of science, the things that I study all day long, as being part of that creation that God, the primary cause, has made. And of course we want to study that, and that's what scientists do. Scientific investigation is all about studying the things that are being made and those secondary causes that cause them to exist. But that's only half the picture. We can also have theological investigations. We can study the primary cause as well as the secondary causes. And if you see things like this, you realise, well, actually I don't have to choose. I can do my theological investigations into God, the primary cause, and I can do my scientific investigations into everything that exists and all those secondary causes whereby they exist. That's quite a philosophical mouthful, and I do promise you fun tonight. Let's think of it in slightly more human terms. So my wife recently had a long-awaited reunion with an old school friend. They hadn't seen each other for 40 years, so huge amounts of life had gone by since their last communication. So you can just imagine the sorts of yakking and questions and chat that went on. And of course they wanted to know about where we lived and that sort of thing. I just imagine some of the questions that might have been asked by this long-lost friend. Can you imagine that friend asking whether our roof was tiled or thatched, whether our house had a brick or timber frame, asking how many millimetres thick our double glazing gap is? Of course not. These are what we call house questions. They're technical questions about the house that we live in. Of course, the conversation that really happened was not so much about the house, it was about the home questions. She wanted to know about our family, who lives there. She wanted to know if we liked the place, what our memories were, if we had pets, if our parents were still alive and living nearby, who were our neighbours, why did we choose to live where we choose? These are home questions. And although house and home are in some senses closely related and just opposite sides of the same coin, they are fundamentally different types of questions. And the house questions, these technical questions about the construction of a building, these are much closer to scientific questions in the scientific method. We can describe those as what questions, or how questions, or when questions. They're quantitative. You can answer them with a number. They're objective. no matter who's answering them, you should always get the same answer. Whereas on the other hand, the home questions are much more like questions of faith. They're about who, they're about why, they're qualitative. You don't give an answer with a number. They're personal. You don't get the same answer if you ask two different people. And they're much more about identity than physical reality. And yet we both agree, if you're having a conversation with a long-lost friend, it's great to talk about home. And if you're having questions with an architect or a builder, it's great to talk about house. Both can coexist, and I don't feel the need to only talk about one and not the other. So to go back to our original dilemma, do we need the Bible or do we need the microscope and telescope? I think I want to say, I want both. I want the Bible in order to address those personal, subjective, who, why, relational questions. And I want the microscope and the telescope to answer those technical, quantitative questions, the what, the hows, and the whens. And probably one of the greatest thinkers in this whole science and faith area is a man called Professor John Polkinghorne, who you may have heard of. He was a theoretical physicist until about his mid-40s at the University of Cambridge. And then at the age of, I think, 45, he gave it all up and he turned his collar around and became ordained as a vicar in the Church of England, and then spent the rest of his career thinking and writing about religion, and in particular the science-religion interface. And he really has laid the groundwork in 20th century thought for how we really think about these things. He's a real hero of the thinking of this area. And he talks about a binocular approach. And he says, I need the binocular approach of science and religion if I'm to do any sort of justice to the deep and rich reality of the world in which we live. And of course, by the binocular approach, he means one eye on the house questions and one eye on the home questions. And as we know, binoculars give you the best vision, as you see with both eyes, and not just with one. Let me introduce you to George Lemaitre. So George Lemaitre is a physicist, mathematical physicist, and he was the man who coined the term Big Bang. So all of our modern cosmology about the origins of the universe, the standard scientific model for how the universe began, were really pieced together by George Lemaitre. But if you can see in the picture there, see his neck. He's wearing a dog collar. He was actually a Catholic priest. And so again, we find the roots of modern science, we find a person of faith. And he was a very concise and succinct man, and he said, there were two ways of arriving at the truth. I decided to follow them both. So I think we can hopefully leave to one side this idea of rival explanations. We want both. We want house questions answering, we want home questions answering. Let's think a little bit now about the Bible. So for some people, this is a major issue in trying to reconcile science and faith. The line of thought goes, the Bible makes some specific claims, especially in the book of Genesis, about the beginning of the world, the beginning of the universe, the origin of humans. Modern science has learned an awful lot about these things and has a fairly well developed story about those two things. Those two stories are different, therefore I have to choose one of them, and the one I don't choose I have to reject as false. And the problem with that is it assumes that the Bible is making scientific claims in the first place. So that can lead to great confusion, questions over things like Adam and Eve, or the 6 days of creation. You sometimes hear people say, why doesn't the Bible talk about dinosaurs? Questions of miracles. How do we deal with that? And I think actually we can look to the person you might think as having had the biggest problem with science and faith, but actually who didn't really have a problem at all. Galileo Galilei. You remember the story with Galileo about when the Earth went around the Sun, and the Sun went round the Earth. And actually Galileo was great. He was a brilliant theologian, very faithful to the Bible, and he was a great scientist. And there wasn't really any conflict in his mind. And the way he put it was, the Bible shows the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go. And it was just a reminder that the Bible is a book with a limited mission. It doesn't claim to be a repository of all possible knowledge. It doesn't make any particular claims about scientific mechanism. And indeed, in many places, it just assumes the scientific outlook of the people that it was talking about at the time, the author or the recipients of a particular letter or passage. The Bible's mission is narrow. It's a theological book. It's talking about bigger questions, questions of God, questions of people, questions of relationship. As Galileo put it, how to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go. When it comes to those other questions, the way the heavens go, God has given us the gift of science to work that out for ourselves. We don't have a textbook, and He's not divinely inspired one for that. And once we realise that, once we realise that the Bible isn't trying to make scientific claims, we read it in a very different sort of way. I think the reason that we assume it is trying to make scientific claims is because in our modern culture, a scientific outlook is the highest form of truth. And so we do the Bible the honour, if you like, of assuming it is working in the highest form of truth, which is the sphere of scientific narrative. But it's not. And I don't actually believe that scientific narrative is the highest form of truth. I think that is actually a mistake that scientists sometimes make. But once we realise that the Bible has got a different mission, it all becomes a lot clearer, and there's a lot less tension between it and science. And I should say, speaking for myself as a very enthusiastic and committed scientist, within the spectrum of Christians, I'm at the most enthusiastic end about the Bible. I'm not one of these Christians that throws the Bible out or says you can pick and choose the bits that you like. For me and my faith, the Bible is absolutely central. And yet I find it very easy to reconcile it with a scientific outlook because it's not trying to make scientific truth claims. We're doing well. Let's take a word or two about Charles Darwin. So I have the privilege of being a fellow of Darwin College in Cambridge, which I think is the prettiest of all the colleges. It's not actually named after Charles Darwin, it's named after his descendants, his family, George Darwin and people like that. But nevertheless, you can't get away from Charles Darwin around the place. And I became a fellow there about 12 years ago. And when I became a fellow, I told some Christian friends of mine about what I was doing in Cambridge these days. And they looked at me and, it must be very difficult for you. And their assumption was that as a Christian, being associated with Charles Darwin must be somehow a very difficult thing to reconcile, a very problematic thing, because from their perspective, this was the great enemy, the man that was out to disprove their faith. But actually, if you look into Darwin and his life and his thinking, that was far from the case. To be honest, Darwin had very little interest in questions of religion. He started his life as quite a committed Christian, and then he had a terrible personal tragedy. His little daughter died. And as happens with some people, it shook his faith really quite dramatically. And that actually was what drove his religious outlook far more than anything that he discovered in his science. And you can look this up for yourself. There's a university project, a Cambridge University project, to collect and put online all of Darwin's correspondence. And so you can go online and just look at everything he wrote. And there's a really interesting letter where somebody wrote to him and said, "Dear Mr. Darwin, I'm worried about your new science. I'm a Christian. Are you saying that I'm wrong, that I can't believe in God anymore?" And Darwin wrote back, and he said, "It seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist." So Darwin is saying it is absurd to think that you can't be both a practicing Christian and believe in his scientific theories of evolution. For him, there was no reason they should come into any sort of conflict whatsoever. And that's very much the way that I see it as well. I've never found a moment of conflict between these two things. So, let me just give you one final thought just to chew over. This fabulous picture. So this is from the Hubble telescope, the M44 Nebula super bubble, as it's known. Just unbelievable complexity. This is where we live. This is the universe. And just all of that detail, all of that complexity. And actually, I'm not the sort of physicist that spends much time looking upwards. I don't really use telescopes in my own research. I'm actually a microscope guy. I spend my life surrounded by atoms. So let's go from this extreme of the far universe right down to the atomic scale. And let's just take some table salt, some sodium chloride. Within a 10-gram serving of salt, so a decent spoonful of salt, there are 2 times 10 to the 23 atoms. That's 200,000 atoms. That's actually equal to the number of stars in the known universe. So just the amount of salt that you would put into spaghetti bolognese is as many atoms as there are stars in the universe. And between these two extremes, the scale of the universe and the scale of the atomic realm, the universe is just truly astounding. We live in a wonderful, wonderful place. And it's not just that it exists, it's the fact that we can understand it. I won't bore you with it now, but I can take you into enormous detail of how those atoms hold together, and the electrons that are involved, and what happens when you bring other atoms nearby. We understand it. We know how this stuff works. And the same physics that describes those atoms goes all the way up and describes those stars as well. And it's truly amazing, not that it exists, but that humans can really understand it. And Einstein absolutely got this. Einstein's one of my absolute scientific heroes. And he said, the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle. And this is a huge challenge to atheists. The atheist view that science explains the universe completely misses the point that it doesn't explain why science works at all. Or as has been said elsewhere, what breathes fire into the equations that science describes. And this for me is the starting point of realizing that there is so much more than the physical world. The fact that we can understand the physical world, to me, is a huge sign saying there must be more than that as well. So let me just, in a final couple of slides, let me just share 1 or 2 verses of the Bible that I find personally explains this for me, how I see the world. So we've heard it already tonight, but Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. And it goes on to say, day after day, they pour forth speech. And that's very much how I see science. It's the heavens, by which it means astronomy, but then by extension all the way down to the atomic scale. These are speaking about the glory of God. And anybody who's looked at the Hubble telescope or has looked down a microscope at the atomic world can't fail to see that description of the glory of God. There's a lovely verse in the book of Proverbs in the Bible, Proverbs 25:2. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, to search out a matter is the glory of kings. And that's to me very much the scientific process. We are searching out, we're seeking out these matters, these glorious matters that have been concealed by God. And then, finally, probably my favourite verse in the entire Bible, from the very back end of the Bible, Revelation 4, verse 11. I think of this as the roll call of honour. It's the end of time, and it's the angels praising God for the greatest things he's done throughout all of history. And it says, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honour and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." So at the end of time, the thing that the angels point to as one of God's greatest achievements is the physical creation that he's brought into being. And there's a scientist whose job it is to unpack that, to search out those matters, is a wonderful, wonderful way to spend life. I hope this has helped. I hope it's helped more than it's hindered. If this has whetted your appetite and you'd like to think more about these things, like to listen to some more things, read some more things, let me point you to the Faraday Institute. So the Faraday Institute is Cambridge University's science and religion think tank. And there's a website there which has got loads of great resources. It's got lectures, it's got papers, it's got a whole load of stuff. Please do visit that and have a browse around and see if there's anything there that appeals. With that, I'm going to draw breath, and I thank you very much for listening so patiently, and we'll have a little break, and then we can talk some more, a little bit more directly one-to-one. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. It's been wonderful to be able to reflect with you and to think about some of those common themes. And I know there's been some people who've come in today saying, people do talk about this, they ask about this. What do I say to my nephew, niece, grandson, friend, neighbour when they come with these questions? And in fact, I was up at Samuel Ward. I go in about once a fortnight, and I always go in with a question on a board. And they get to vote with a star. And I just went up with your question, science or faith, friends or foes. And we had about a 50-50 spread of people who said yes, they could be friends, and people who said no, they had to be opposed to each other. So it's very much a live question, and I just thank you for the opportunity to reflect, and thank you to Haverhill Town Council and to those who organised the Science Festival for allowing us to be part of it as churches together, and to all those who supported the festival. We're going to have, I suggest we have, we said about 10-15 minutes break, so if we come back together about 10 to 8, there's some paper and pencils on the front, so if you've got some questions for Russell, please jot those down. That will help us to organise the Q&A. But feel free to just talk to each other, reflect on what you've heard, and then we're going to come back together at 10 to 8 to continue with a bit of question and answer for Russell. Thank you.
Don't worry about that. You write it down.
From the What is the other one?
Really interesting. But they were lovely. They were just so sweet. They looked at us so well. Let's take a chat about the next week. Monsoon. It's like the flood and buffet there. Don't you get in around house? There are. We had a careful plan check, which is, it's just destroying in minutes.
Well, I suppose, yeah, that has a, yeah, I suppose it's a different
anniversary, which we got together, the lecturer was still alive. And we've got quite a few of our lecturers.
That's also not understood.
Electric shock. Did I come away? If I had thought this is things, no responsibility in the sharpening of the pencil.
massive time. Talking about because we have Oh yeah, yeah.
Excellent. We've got some excellent questions for Russell. You've all put your thinking caps on, and whether or not this is highbrow or lowbrow, I make no comment on which of those it might be. We've definitely got some good questions for you, Russell. For those watching live online, you can submit questions online. We haven't had any, but if you've got any burning questions on your hearts, then let us know as well. I'm going to start with this question about our inquiry of truth and understanding. As a researcher, what convinces you that you have a valid interpretation or explanation of the situation? And what convinces you that you have a valid interpretation of God?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the way I see it is those two things are not a million miles apart. They are different. The way that I know things scientifically is not exactly the same as the way I would claim to know things theologically, but I think there's more overlap than many people might expect. So, for example, I'm a nanotechnologist, so I study very, very small things. I'm all about the atoms. So, things that are much, much smaller than me, things that are too small to see with the human eye, too small to feel by touch. So, even though I've spent my whole life studying the electron, I've never seen an electron. All I know about an electron are by indirect measurements. And so the way most modern science goes on is that you've never got as much data as you'd like. You've never got as clear a view as you'd like. But you've got something. And it's therefore about making the most rational decision faced with the limited evidence that you've got. So that's, as a scientist, how I decide what my views are. And it's the same with theological views, with views of God. I would love to know more. You know, I would love to see more. And the Bible says that, you know, we see through a mirror dimly at the moment. It's like seeing through a really bad, darkened piece of glass. But we don't see nothing. And so with what's given in the Bible, what I know about the life of Jesus, that is enough to be able to make a rational decision based on a limited data set. So I think it's basically the same process, but they are distinct. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to say that I came to my beliefs of faith through exactly the same process that I came to my beliefs in physics. But as I say, in both cases, you're making the best choice given the limited amount of data that you've got.
Thank you. And please do, if you've got follow-up questions, or I put the paper at the back, so you can pick the paper up or just call me over and we can take follow-up questions as well. But I've got a couple of people asking about this rivalry then between science and faith. One person asking about, is it worth trying to understand this, how science and faith work together? Is that a worthwhile inquiry, or is that just over-analysing? And then someone else is talking about, well, when you see scientists, popular scientists in particular, perhaps we can think of some examples of scientists in the public eye who feel a need to comment on their non-belief in God. What's going on there? Is there something going on there about this rivalry, trying to almost stoke the rivalry? If you can speak to those.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's take the first one. Is it worth thinking about these things? I mean, I think it's worth it for two reasons. First of all, if you think that science is a reason not to consider the claims that Jesus makes, then I would encourage you to think again. So some people use science as a reason to not have to think about other things, in particular about Jesus. And I don't think that's valid. I don't think science is that get out of jail free card. I think the claims of Jesus stand as they are, and that we each have to think about those and decide if we believe that Jesus was telling the truth or if he was lying. Or to quote C.S. Lewis, was he mad, was he bad, or was he God? And science doesn't give us a way to bypass that question. The other reason I think it's worth thinking about these things is because, I think Max, you alluded to it during your opening, that actually the overlap between science and faith, because they are different, they're not the same thing. You've got science and you've got faith, but they overlap and they share the same subject matter, as in the world we live in. That overlap is a really rich place. So I think there are great ways in which my faith helps my science, and I think there are great ways in which my science helps my faith. And that's a very profitable area to think about. So yeah, those two reasons I would really encourage to think about this interface, and it's not overanalyzing, it's really fruitful stuff. Could you quickly remind me of the second question?
And then we were thinking about popular scientists from a non-theist point of view.
I mean, it's very hard to generalise. There's no one reason for it that covers everybody, but there are a number of reasons. So there's always been a group of people who've tried to use science to further a particular cause. It's really interesting. Darwinism has been prime territory for this. If you follow the way throughout the last 100, 150 years, if you follow the way that people have used Darwin's theory of evolution, there's hardly anybody who hasn't tried to use it for their own means. So, we've had communists have used it, we've had capitalists have used it, eugenicists have used it. All sorts of people have tried to use it, and therefore it's no surprise that people of atheist persuasion or of other philosophical views have also tried to use it. It's a very attractive thing, and actually this is a recurring pattern in all of science. You can look at many different big scientific theories, and you find that what often happens is that other non-scientific worldviews get attached to them as a means of legitimizing them. So I think there's a bit of that going on in some cases. In some cases there is a bit of misunderstanding going on, and hopefully that's what I've tried to address there tonight. There's also something called scientism. And scientism is the religion of science. It's the position that says there is nothing except science, and that science answers all valid questions. And clearly, if you subscribe to scientism, then you do very naturally have a conflict with religion, because essentially scientism is a rival religion, and you've made your choice. And certainly in some cases, that is what's going on. These people are followers of scientism. So lots of reasons.
Thank you. And again, I guess one of the things behind that question is that is where a lot of the questions we get will be coming from. People who've said they've seen something on television and it clearly doesn't fit with what they perceive as a religious worldview. And so I hope that's been helpful in answering some of those questions. But if you want to push that further, then let us know. I have got a couple of more particular questions, pressing you on particularly the relationship between creationism and Darwinism. So the questions in particular: how should one explain the dinosaurs, and how does one explain Adam and Eve to non-believers? That's how it's written on this card. So I think if you could just speak to that from your own point of view.
So we should explain the dinosaurs in the way that any scientist would explain the dinosaurs. A creature that found its own environmental niche at a time before humans existed, which thrived for a certain time, and then environmental conditions changed suddenly, probably because of a collision, an asteroid collision, and they weren't able to adapt, and they went extinct. And that's, I'm not saying anything different to what any scientist would say about the dinosaurs. The reason I mentioned them was that sometimes people question why there are no dinosaurs in the Bible. And one argument is that the Bible is made up and didn't know about those. Another answer, which is the one I would follow, is there aren't any dinosaurs in Animal Farm or Delia's Complete Cookery book, or there are many books in the world that don't have dinosaurs in because they're not relevant to the discussion at hand. And if you, as I do, believe the Bible has a particular message, a particular discussion, and dinosaurs aren't relevant to that, then why should they be? Why should they be there? Yeah.
Thank you. So what about
So the other half?
what about Adam and Eve? And another question actually says, well, if the Bible isn't intended as scientific explanation of creation, what is the correct interpretation of the story of creation?
Right, thank you. Yes, that's a fantastic question. So, I mean, Christians disagree on this. There is no single view, and I can't represent all of Christian thinking to you. All I can tell you is the range of things that people have thought, and I can tell you what I personally think. So, there are some Christians that see Adam and Eve as a literal first pair of humans. Most extreme end, some Christians would date those to about 6,000 years ago. And clearly that view is incompatible with modern science. There's plenty of evidence to say that humans have been around for an awful lot longer than that. And then there are a variety of positions, and they're probably at the other end of the spectrum. You've got the view that it is an entirely theological story that you're not supposed to take literally in any sense, and that there are theological truths being taught here. I mean, I mentioned Animal Farm a few minutes ago. It's a bit like that we read Animal Farm. We're not meant to learn anything about talking pigs. We're meant to learn about the dangers of communism, I think that's clear. So that's the spectrum that's set out, and I think there are 7 well-defined theological positions you can hold on that spectrum, and I'm sure all 7 are represented in this building. I think my personal view is I'm more towards this end, and remember, I take the Bible really, really seriously. So I want to ask, for me, the key question is, what was the intent of the author, the human author? Because the Bible has lots of different types of writing in it. Remember, the Bible is not a book, it's a library, it's a collection of books. And each of those books has a different style. So for me, the question is, what is the style of this writing? Is it poetry? Is it journalism? Is it science? Whatever. And therefore, once I know the style of that writing, what are the normal rules of engagement? What can I expect it to be telling me? How am I supposed to interpret it? And my personal view is that, in terms of style of writing, Genesis is a theological essay. I think there's also the possibility it is polemic, in as much as it's written in order to contrast with something that other people think and just say, no, you're wrong. But I think primarily it is a theological essay. And therefore, the author doesn't want us to try to draw scientific truths from those two people. But I don't want to push that, because some Christians would say otherwise.
Thank you. And I think, if I may add to that, one of the things that I particularly appreciate in the style of worship that we have here at St Mary's and that I'm used to, is how those stories are used in our worship can be really instructive to how we relate to those. And we've just come through Easter, and the way that our liturgies contrast the Genesis creation narrative with our new creation resurrection narrative as Christians is a really interesting way to think about that creation story. How do we use it in our worship? Therefore, how is it forming us as Christians in our thinking and our relationship with the world? It might just help to think about how we therefore understand a story like Genesis. And that will be true of any other religion. How does the Quran inform Muslims in their life and worship? is true of many texts.
Can I say one more thing? Some of you may have come across what's known as young Earth creationism. So when I said about 4,004 BC, 6,000 years ago, that is a very, very new idea. It was really only around the mid-1900s or so that any Christians began to take that view particularly seriously. For most of Christian history, people have understood that the earth is much older, and that 6 days of creation were at the very least extended periods, and that there was no fundamental incompatibility with the age of the earth as told by science versus the description given in Genesis. So don't think that, the original authentic believers had a scientific view of Genesis and that we've somehow rationalized it away. It's quite the reverse, actually. It's a very modern infection to think of Genesis as describing a very young earth. When it's only really a very young earth that causes any sort of fundamental problems with science.
Thank you. Let's change tack a bit. And somebody's asking, do you know roughly the sort of ratio or percentage of people working within the scientific community who would appreciate that religion and science are complementary, and who would take an opposing view?
Yeah, it's a quantitative question.
It is.
I can answer you with numbers. I love numbers. Okay, so let me tell you about 3 different surveys, all taking place in America, because America is a really interesting test bed for these sorts of questions, because it's a leading centre of science, and there's loads of religion around it as well. So it's a really great place to test the compatibility or otherwise. So the first survey goes back to 1911 or 1917? I think it was 1911, so a long time ago. And the question that was used was, do you believe in a personal God to whom you can pray? And this question was put to 1,000 professional American scientists. And roughly a third said yes, a third said don't know, and a third said no. Then in the late 1980s, 1986 I think, the same survey was repeated. Now by modern standards, that's not a great question, but they intentionally used exactly the same question because they wanted to track changes of thinking across the 20th century. Remarkably, almost exactly the same results came out. There were slightly fewer in the don't know category. People have become slightly more polarised and definite in their views. But by and large, 2 world wars and essentially the entire modern scientific revolution had hardly made the needle flicker at all in the religious views of professional American scientists. The most recent survey was done just a few years ago by something called the Pew Research Institute. And I know that with the word Pew, it makes it sound as a church-based thing, but it isn't. The Pew Institute is a very well-respected political canvassing organisation in America. And they asked a slightly more nuanced question. And if you add together the views of those that would subscribe to a personal God to whom you could pray, combined with those who believed in some sort of external life force that we wouldn't quite identify as a Christian God or even a monotheistic God, but nevertheless something supernatural, you got to about 51%. So it was really pretty similar actually to what the early study said. It's about a third are convinced that a personal God to whom you can pray, a third are convinced that there isn't, and the other third either don't know or are happy to go along with a slightly more watered down version. So that's not a million miles away from what the general public think. The only caveat on that, in the interest of full disclosure, is there was a survey about 20 years ago where senior scientists were studied, so the upper echelons of the scientific community. And there they found a greater prevalence of atheism than in the general population, and indeed in the wider body of scientists. And that's interesting, that's worth thinking about. I mean, you could say that those high-level scientists are better scientists, and therefore better scientists are more atheists. That's one interpretation. I don't think it's the only interpretation. I I think many of us know from experience that rising to the upper echelons of any organisation puts personal strains on you that makes you cynical, makes you doubt views that you had in your youth, just as would happen outside science. So yeah, there's lots of interesting data out there, but by and large, you find a similar spread of people to what you find outside science. Some believe, some don't, some aren't sure.
Excellent, thank you. I've still got a few more questions of those that have been submitted, but is there anybody wanting to follow up with anything that Russell said so far?
Do you not think that the questions about creation and Adam and Eve are really irrelevant to modern Christian? Surely the basis of a Christian is the New Testament and the life of Jesus. And not the other stuff is, we may or may not believe it, but surely it's what Jesus said and did. It's important, really.
I mean, I guess some Christians would see it that way. I mean, some people would take a wider view. They would say, Christianity is the Old Testament and the New Testament. And Jesus clearly believed the Old Testament. I mean, Jesus knew his Old Testament better than any of us. He was absolutely committed to that Old Testament. So some people would say, if science disproves the roots of that Old Testament, then everything else must fall. So I guess some might try to hold on to a New Testament only view, but it's a bit of a push, I think. Especially given how, to my mind at least, how key the authenticity of Jesus is. If Jesus was wrong about the Old Testament, I can't really accept him as God's revelation. It means he was fundamentally mistaken, and that does cause everything else to fall.
I agree. Don't take what I said earlier about reading the creation narrative in Genesis in the light of the resurrection. Yes, that is how we read it at Easter, and that's a really fruitful way of doing it. But I didn't mean by that we should ignore reading Genesis for its own sake. So I would agree with Russell that as a Christian I recognise that both the Old and New Testaments are divinely inspired, and we do read both and grapple with both. Which leaves us with some hard questions. So we don't ignore that. And if we had all the answers, then I wouldn't be in a job either. So there's that. Russell, when did the divide between science and faith occur? You mentioned some of this history. When did the divide, and how is it that people create those barriers and exclude one from the other?
Okay. I mean, there are so many routes. Let me point to a couple of key points in history. So, before the time of Jesus, the dominant way of thinking about the world came from people like Plato, from the Greeks. And they had a very particular take that our modern mindset we find bizarre, but for them it made perfect sense. So if you were a Greek and you wanted to really understand the universe, what you did was you went to the top of a mountain, far away from all other people, from all other distractions, and you just thought clever thoughts. It was all about trying to get rid of the physical creation around you, because that was just pollution. If you wanted to know truth, you had to get away from all of this reality around you, because that just confused things. And that's where people thought for a very long time. That's not where scientists think. That's the key. The way a scientist thinks is that we think clever things, and then we do go to the top of the mountain and get away from all to think those thoughts. But until we've come back to the lab and we've done an experiment in which we've actually tested those thoughts against reality, we don't know if they're right or wrong. For a modern scientist, the physical world around us is the absolute arbiter of truth. And that's a really different way of thinking. And it's actually a very Christian way of thinking, because whereas for the Greeks, they thought the physical world was bad, The scientist thinks the physical world is essential, and the Christian thinks the physical world is good because it was made by God. So actually, the modern scientist and the Christian have got an awful lot more in common in the way they think about things. They both put a very high value on physical creation than the way people have thought for actually most of human civilization. So that's one really important divide, the difference between Greek thinking, Platonic Plato-type thinking, and scientific stroke Christian thinking. We mentioned Galileo. It was actually that divide was what got in the way of Galileo. So when Galileo first, because remember, Galileo was using observation. He wasn't thinking glorious thoughts. He was saying, you can think what you like, but I've looked from my telescope and I can see what's going on out there. And when he first presented it, the Pope said, good on you, that's great. I love your thinking, I love the way you've used the physical creation. This is the future, this is the way we should go forward. But there were other political factions around at the time, some within the church, some outside of the church, that were brought up in the old ways of Plato, the old Greek thought, the non-Christian Greek thought. And they said, well, no, that's not right. You can't derive truth by looking through a telescope. You can only derive truth by isolated thinking. So actually, a lot of the Galileo alleged fight between, that's often portrayed as a fight between faith and science, was actually a fight between old Platonic Greek thinking and modern scientific stroke Christian thinking. So I think that's another important point of conflict. Around the time of Charles Darwin, as I say, Darwin really didn't care about the implications of his work for religion. He didn't think that it was relevant. But there was somebody else around the time called Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. And he had an agenda to push. And it was largely an atheist agenda. And he was one of the first to effectively hijack Darwin's work to try to use it for his own ideological ends. So he stirred up a lot of dissent there. And again, what's really interesting is, remember at the time when Darwin was writing, all of the universities were filled with clergy. You had to be an ordained member of the Church of England in order to be a lecturer in the university. And very soon after Darwin published his work, the universities began teaching it. So actually the church accepted Darwin's work very, very quickly. And it was only then with Huxley stirring the pot and trying to use this to push an atheist agenda that there appeared to be the divide. There was then another uprising around the 1920s or so, this time from the side of the Christians. So American Christians who were feeling really quite in fear of their theological position, not because of Darwin or science, but just society in general. They felt there were a lot of people out there who were out to prove them wrong. They start to really dig their heels in. It's where we get the term fundamentalist from, because they said these are the fundamentals, these are the basis of the things that we believe. And they started fighting against a lot of things that didn't need to be fought against. And science was one of them. And so the fight came from the Christians, actually, not from the scientists. Then it went quiet for a while, and then the so-called new atheists arose in the last 20, 30 years, Richard Dawkins and three others. And they essentially revived a lot of arguments that had been dealt with in medieval times. Didn't really bring anything new, but just reopened the questions. And that gave the impression that this was an unresolved matter, whereas actually it was pretty resolved, and has been resolved since medieval times. I hope that helps.
Thank you. And I'm struck by what you pick out there about fear actually being quite a big part of this. And we've got another question here about why do some scientists feel, and people of faith, feel threatened by each other? Does fear, because fear is not a scientific concept in that way. So does fear play a part of this?
Oh yeah, remember scientists are humans. I mean, I'm tired tonight because I've spent all day in a departmental away day, a strategy day. So from 9 o'clock this morning until 5 o'clock tonight, we've been talking about the future and which research areas will get funded and what we're going to do. And I can tell you, it's been a human day. We weren't just sitting there writing equations on a blackboard. We were trying to we were trying to stake out territory. We were being primeval. So scientists are very human, and all of the emotions of fear and aspiration and worry and pride and ambition and all of these human things absolutely play a part in how we operate. And so, yeah, I think fear has been part of it on both sides. And you know, I speak to groups where it's the Christians are afraid of how the way that atheists are using science. But I speak to other groups where it's the Christians who are leading the charge and are actually out to attack science. And it goes both ways. So a little bit of understanding each other's position can help to smooth things over.
And perhaps that speaks to that question about, is it worth pursuing this interaction between science and faith? Because acknowledging that human element in both could be hugely constructive.
Absolutely. And in reality, a lot of Christians don't know any scientists, and a lot of scientists don't know any Christians. And again, that fear of the unknown can be quite powerful. So I feel myself as a sort of an envoy between the two worlds. I speak both.
Excellent. Well, okay, on the subject of the unknown, we've got one question here asking about the concept of dark matter or dark energy. Could you speak to that?
I wish I could.
Right.
So they're separate things. Those are two different things. Dark energy is not dark matter. They're different, completely different things. So it all comes down to how quickly the universe is expanding. So we've got, go back to the Big Bang, everything gets blown outwards, but then gravity causes everything to attract to each other, and that therefore slows it down. Think of it as gravity as being like a big spring between all of these things flying apart. It starts to windshift back in again. And we can look at detailed measurements of exactly how quickly different stars, depending how far away from us, are moving away, because the whole universe is expanding. And we can see how quickly that is changing. And the problem is it doesn't really agree with our mathematical models. If we just take into account the energy things have from the Big Bang and then slowing down from gravity, we can't make the maths add up. There's something missing. And so one of the things that's been suggested is there is some other stuff out there. It must be dark because we can't see it, but it must be responsible for changing the rate at which the universe is expanding. Because it's dark, it doesn't show up in our telescopes or in our microscopes. It's really hard for us to study. So we only really know it's there just by inference from the fact that if we only take into account the things that we can see, we can't build an accurate picture of the world. But we really know very little about it. And this is the big frontier of modern physics as to what is dark energy, what is dark matter. The other thing we know is that in dark matter, there's an awful lot of it. The actual fraction, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's about 5% of the things that we think of as stuff. So us, and planets, and rocks, and lecterns, and atoms, chemicals, all that sort of stuff, only accounts for about 5% of all of the mass in the universe. So that means we are ignorant about 95% of the universe that we live in. So we're still actually, I'm sure, in the year 2500, people will look back at us and say, boy, those 21st century people were really primitive. They only knew about 5% of the universe. But that's where we are.
And I wonder if that's part of where this having to be theoretical in a sort of isolated sense, and having to be inquisitive and study the available evidence slightly come together. And I put in mind, there's been a bit of discussion recently, obviously, about Peter Higgs and his prediction, because I'm right in saying he predicted the Higgs boson, but didn't have the direct evidence for it at the time. So I wonder if there's something there about, there is an element of predicting and thinking what if in science as well, and sort of being able to bring those together in a constructive space.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And the difference between a theoretical physicist and a mathematician is that the theoretical physicist cares about whether their equations match reality, whereas a mathematician doesn't. All a mathematician cares about is the equation true? Is it self-consistent within the rest of mathematics? But for physicists and scientists, as I said before, external reality is the master arbiter. If your theory doesn't match what you observe, your theory is worthless. So Peter Higgs made that, amazing prediction of the Higgs particle, but until somebody's actually observed it, which they did through the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, it has no value. And it's the combination of the two that leads us to what we consider to be scientific truth.
Interesting, but it's interesting that we celebrate Higgs for his prediction, despite the fact that, as you're saying, he didn't have the evidence, and therefore one could throw his prediction out as worthless, and yet we celebrate him.
Well, we celebrate him because experiment proved him right.
In the end.
At the end,
yes.
yeah, that's
So we
right.
have the hindsight to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's the way it tends to work. So, just again, up the road in Cambridge, in my department, there was a guy called Brian Josephson, who in the 1970s, actually as part of his PhD work, remarkably, predicted a particular quantum effect. And it was seen as crazy at the time. And I remember the head of department was very sniffy about him publishing it. He said, this makes us look bad. You're just throwing out wild ideas. And just 2 or 3 years later, an experimentalist managed to create what he predicted and proved him right. And the Nobel Prize came by return post, pretty much. That until that experiment had been done, he was just a lunatic. But once the experiment was done, he was the cleverest physicist ever.
Excellent. I've got one more question from Charmaine to come to in a moment, but have we got anything else?
Actually, can I just pick up on one last thought on that?
Yes, please do.
I said before that the scientific method and the approach to faith, to Christian faith, are not a million miles apart. I think that example of having clever thoughts that are only validated by experiments is actually a really nice analogue for at least the way I see Christian faith. That we can think theological thoughts. People sometimes say, I like to think of God as, but actually until they are validated by some external reality, they are only possible thoughts. They don't really have that much value. And for me, the person of Jesus is that experiment. He is the physical evidence as to whether a particular thought about God is true or not, which is why I was putting so much stress on the claims of Jesus, because I think he claims to be that physical, real-world validation of what we may or may not think about God.
So would you say someone like Thomas, I will not believe until I place my fingers into his wounds and my hand in his side? Is that the sort of confirmation of reality you're looking for? Because obviously we don't have that opportunity today.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be physical touch, but St. Paul in the New Testament talks about how if the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, then Christians are wasting their time. So I think that's an example of external validation. So he says, you can be as religious as you like, you can enjoy church and all that, but if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, then you're just kidding yourselves. And in the particular case, the people he was writing to, they were under quite a lot of pressure for being Christians. He says, it's not worth it. You're being persecuted. You're being persecuted for a fairy tale. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, that changes everything, because now you're being persecuted for something that is externally real, something that is validated, and that is definitely worth doing. So, again, it's not quite the same as the scientific method, but it's a cousin, it's a first cousin of it, I would say.
And the word that gets used is witness, which the Greek is martyr. So those who've actually died for their faith are those who witness to it in the extreme of persecution. And I guess there's a parallel, as you say, not an exact correlation, but a parallel between our evidence, what we can see, and what we can see in the lives of others of faith that make us believe or not in what motivated them. Any more questions before we bring things to a close? it's been, I'd say it's been wonderful to share this time and to kick off the public side of the Science Festival with this wonderful opportunity to reflect. So Charmaine was asking particularly about opportunities to take this further, and you've mentioned the Faraday Institute, who we're very grateful for. It was through the Faraday Institute that I was put in touch with Russell, and we managed to organise this event, and they do all sorts of other wonderful things in and around Cambridge, and do make use of what they've got to offer. Charmaine was asking particularly about, there was a series held at the Wesleyan Chapel at the end of Jesus Lane, Science Meets Faith. Is there any chance of that sort of discussion happening? I guess, Charmaine, was the fact that was in a church space particularly helpful?
No, I don't think that was not to me. No, it was the fact that you had two completely separate cohorts meeting on minds, debating in depth, which went beyond me most of the time. It was a fantastic experience.
So are there those sorts of opportunities? Do you know of anything like
Well, I
that?
mean, the Faraday Institute runes monthly seminars. So I think they call them the research seminars, but they're open to the public. I think there's even free lunch. And they bring a very wide variety of people in. So it's a very mixed bag. But that is, month by month, there's an opportunity there. There is, what else is going on? I mean, for those who want to take it further, the Faraday runs a summer course, a residential summer course. Well, if you live here, you wouldn't necessarily need the residential part. You have to pay for it, it's quite expensive, but it's a detailed week of lectures. That's really good. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So please do join me in thanking Russell once again for his time tonight and what we've been able to share. Thank you, Russell. Thank you very much, and do look out for more opportunities from the Haverhill Science Festival in terms of our public engagement throughout the rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Nice to meet you.